Thank you all for taking the time to join us on this very interesting topic, preventing ransomware and stopping data exfiltration. So it'll be a 45-minute webinar with about 10 to 15 minutes of Q&A at the end. So feel free to ask as many questions as you like throughout. And if it's not addressed during the webinar, we will cover them at the end. So ransomware and data exfiltration is highly relevant at the moment. I can't go to a security conference or even look on LinkedIn without seeing information about the recent attacks on the retail, like Marks and Spencers and Harrods and Co-ops. And with that in mind for today, we'll start by sharing some important information from inside the attack, where Eddie will be walking the audience through real-world attack methods, how ransomware and data exfiltration are happening right now, which vulnerabilities are being used, and how attackers are bypassing defenses. Then we'll shift to resilience building, where Jeffrey will share his insights into how organizations build resilience, implement best practices, and provide tips on how to respond to those threats. And then finally, both speakers will come together for a short panel and live audience Q&A. So we're very lucky to have the caliber of speakers who live and breathe this topic on a daily basis. So Edward, or Eddie Skraba, he's SmartTech's very own Global Director of Threat Intelligence. And despite his youthful looks, he's actually got over 20 years of experience in IT and security. And he's very passionate about threat intelligence and spends his days helping customers identify, exploit, harden, and remediate cybersecurity vulnerabilities. We also have another expert in this field, information security analyst for Norstella. They're one of the world's largest pharmaceutical solution providers. And Jeffrey has been working in cybersecurity for almost 7 years and is very interested in cybercrime, particularly ransomware and the evolution of different threat groups. And Jeffrey also writes for his blog, catchingfish.com, which I'd highly recommend reading if you're interested in learning more about ransomware. And finally, myself, Edwin Bowers. I'm a cybersecurity sales leader at SmartTech with over a decade of experience helping customers reduce cyber risk and modernize their security operations. And I'll be facilitating this very interesting conversation. So I now hand over to Eddie to talk through the recent attacks.
Thank you, Edwin. Hello, everyone. So I'm Edward. I've been doing offensive security as long as I remember, and I will give you some insight how those ransomware attacks looks from offensive security side, what we're seeing as a penetration tester, as ethical hackers, what are the problems exposed and exploited by the threat group, because we in the offensive security are actually using the same techniques. So just a short agenda. We'll talk what's ransomware, who is the victim, how somebody becomes a victim, how somebody becomes targeted, a little bit about the groups that are targeting right now. There are the ransomware groups that are targeting different types of victims, about the techniques and tactics used by those groups for initial access, escalation, lateral movement, exploitation, and of course, the most important, something about defense. So I know that probably most of you already knows the answer to this question, but just for that everybody here is on the same page, I will tell you what's my view on what is ransomware. So think of ransomware as a sort of digital kidnapping of your most critical information. In simple terms, cyber criminals will break into your network, they will seize the data, lock it away so you don't have access to it, you can't use your system, and yeah, of course, they demand ransom from your site to restore that access back. Now, initially, decades ago, this was simply a denial of service problem. And in response, the IT departments invented a very simple remediation for that threat. Implementing immutable and isolated backups become a good answer to mitigate the risk of getting targeted by ransomware attack. Unfortunately, threat actors also evolve, right? So they realize that the data they're getting access to is also valuable not only for the data owner, but is also valuable for third parties. So instead of just locking the access to the data, they can also try to sell the data, either to the owner or the third parties. Now, we call this scheme a double extortion because now you have to pay not only for getting back the access to your system, but you also have to pay for your data not getting leaked to someone else. And a very important thing to notice is when the regulations like GDPR were introduced, well, it kind of protects the users, but unfortunately, it creates some problems for the data owners, and unfortunately, it makes a bit easier for the threat actors, for the ransomware group to play the attacks, because now companies are not only threatened by the loss of the data or losing the access and eventual reputational damage. Threat actors can simply blackmail the organizations that they will simply release the sensitive data to the public, like personal informations. And unfortunately, the owner of the data could probably face legal problems, of course, financial problems from that, from this threat. And there is nothing you can do much about it. I mean, other than trying to prevent the attack from happening. So this is very important to understand that this is the problems that organizations are facing with the ransomware. So now that we know what is ransomware, just to give you some information about statistics, so you get an overview how large that sort of business model is. So currently, different sources are tracking around 265 high-profile ransomware groups from over 443 groups with low profile, or maybe even individuals that are simply trying to get access and sell some leaked data, even without doing that ransomware like encryption part. That just in 2025, we have 3,673 victims of ransomware attacks all over the world. From this number, around 181 attacks were targeted at consumer services industry. Probably the biggest part of industry that is targeted is the technology. There are over 445 victims targeted by ransomware attacks. And just to highlight some of the latest and high profile attacks that happening lately. So Mark and Spencer, probably some of you already heard. UK, one of the Britain's largest retailers, was breached in April, so just like a month ago, and they actually suffered a financial loss around 400 millions because of that attack. Cooperative Group, another just days after Marks and Spencer, another grocery chain retailer was targeted, probably by the same group in UK. This time, at least the victim claimed they've contained the attack, but because of the fact they had to shut down some accesses to prevent escalation of the attack, they've also suffered financial losses. Harrods, another vendor also in UK that was compromised, one of the luxury department store, detected some intrusion attempts in early May, and yeah, they've also had to restrict access to the stores, obviously, which had an impact on salary. And just actually a victim that I've just added before that presentation from my own hood from Poland. Comfort, one of the largest Polish furniture retailer, was compromised a couple days ago by a ransomware group. Actually, I know that they were looking for offensive services a couple months ago. They didn't found any provider, or I don't know, it was too expensive. They didn't agree to the terms. And unfortunately, in the meantime, when they were about to run some penetration testing and protect their network, they got hit. They were down for. They also claimed that they contain the attack at some point, till some point, but unfortunately, because they've had to turn off some of the systems, especially e-commerce websites, they've had a profit loss of a size of 1 million euros a day, and I think the website was down for a couple of days. So you can imagine the scale of what organizations are facing when we're speaking about ransomware attacks. A lot of people I speak with are trying to ask the questions: what's the probability that they will be targeted by attack, by hackers, by ransomware groups, by actually any sort of threat actors? Now, well, you to understand this, to answer that question, we actually got to think what are the motivations behind the threat actors. And it is very important to understand that despite the fact that we will speak about the attack in the retail services, it's, the threat actors actually are not looking strictly toward what industry you're working in. Most important, the most important ransomware motivations is focused around financial gains. So it's a simple business model these days. So threat actors simply do the calculation. What is the cost of compromising company? What will be the profits of selling the data, or either getting paid the ransom? And this is the main motivation behind any attack, whether it's a ransomware attack or any other type of data exfiltration, denial of service attacks. Now, there is obviously an impact when we speak about the potential victims. Some of the some of things depend on what is the profile of the victim. Now, for example, obviously looking at the whole ransomware is a business model. Obviously, the threat actors are looking for somebody who will pay fairly quickly, right? So imagine, for example, hospitals, so healthcare. There are very sensitive data processed there. So obviously, this is something that has an impact on the decision whether the healthcare, whether the victim will pay the ransom. But on the other side, hospitals, healthcare probably will be able to work when attack happen. At least they should be. Yeah, they have to face the legal consequences of eventual data leaks, but probably they will be able to operate. Retail, on the other side, has that problem that when the services are stopped, they don't work. Well, it causes simply a profit losses, and very, very big profit losses, which I showed in the previous slide. As you're seeing, the financial motivations are probably the most important part that depending on who becomes a victim. But also, aside from that, something that people forget often is that hackers actually choosing the targets that are easy to compromise. So in the offensive security, we call it low hanging fruit. So if it takes me 2 days to compromise you and it will cost me like, 5,000, and I can earn like 50,000 from selling the data, it's a 10 times profit, right? So I don't have to explicitly target a large organizations, large groups, and aim for $1 million ransomwares. I actually can target very small providers, very small organizations, which probably have lower security, and it's easier to compromise them. Uh, Last thing in terms of retail services is that, when it comes to retails, and trying to answer why the retail industry is being targeted, well, probably it's because of the complexity of those services. Like, in a typical ecosystem, IT ecosystem of a retailer, there are point of sale systems, inventory databases, different e-commerce platforms, a lot of supply chain providers, and that level of complexity actually makes it hard to make it all properly secure. And when there's a problem with securing things because of the complexity, there's probably a weak spot for threat actors to get in.
So Eddie, are you saying that it's not just retailers that are getting hit, it's everyone, but it's just I presume the retailers are front and center of the news because Mrs. Brown can't get her Marks and Spencer sandwiches anymore, so it becomes a wider news story.
Exactly. They've got used to targeting specific systems. For example, healthcare. They know the systems that are used in hospitals or any other medical providers. But aside from that, there are a lot of threat actors, which are not so big ransomware groups like Logbit or Cloud. They're just bunch of couple script keys that can simply target you. And again, I said they will seek for the weakest target. They will just try to exfiltrate the data. And if you remember what I've mentioned at the beginning, actually these days they don't even have to encrypt your data because of denial of service, because they can simply threaten you. Guys, we will release the data, right? Pay us the ransom, or we will drop the database of your users, of the personal information from your system, or your sensitive financial documents publicly free. We don't have to find anybody who will buy this. We'll simply drop it free, publicly available, and you will face the consequences of a reputational damage and maybe some legal consequences. And that's the leverage that causes the companies to actually think of paying the ransom. And hackers simply use that. that this is a leverage, and it doesn't matter what industry you're working with. Typical ransomware attack is actually made of a couple of phases. This is the same thing that we're doing with where you can see in a penetration testing engagement. You should actually see this in a proper penetration testing engagement. There are different phases of this attack, and my experience is that I've seen, because sometimes I'm involved in forensic investigations. So my experience is that sometimes I've seen victims that were actually a victim of a ransom long before the final impact happened, long before they saw encryption node, ransomware node, or encrypted files in their system have been prevented of working. The first phase is initial access, and a lot of those threat groups are actually not doing that whole attack on their own. There is a big part of the on the dark web, on that industry, which is called initial access brokers, and these are simply the threat actors that are selling access data to some systems. And this is how ransomware groups work. So they're just going to a store, an online store, and they just pay for credentials to access. They're just stealing the victims, doing some reconnaissance, profits and losses calculations. Okay, I'm buying this access, and this access because this will give me that much gain. So, some organizations, again, I said, some organizations are already victims because somebody have access, unauthorized access to their network. It's just that they don't see that because nothing malicious is happening. Somebody got access, somebody gained persistence, and this is what they've done. And yeah, this is happening, for example, through the info stealers. This is one of the latest, very fancy and abused malware type by the threat actors. So info stealers are the piece of malware that are actually uh, leaking credentials from the browsers, from the password managers, and other places. And again, I said, while this is a sort of data leak, this is not that intrusive operation, not that malicious operations that sometimes goes under the radar of the defense teams and defensive systems, because you don't see that somebody password was uploaded somewhere on the internet. And you will only see it when somebody will use that password to get in and then probably try to encrypt the files, or escalate privileges, maybe exploit some vulnerabilities. Of course, there are different techniques and different threats that are abused by the ransomware groups. Some of them are using 0 days, or we call them in offensive security 1 day vulnerabilities. And when a 1 day vulnerability is that a vulnerability where everybody is aware about it, but the vendor hasn't released a patch yet. So you have to face the consequences of either disabling the system or a feature, or you have to implement your own sort of protection. Uh, and yeah, looking at that attack chain, as I said, there's initial access. There is a phase where threat actors are doing some reconnaissance, trying to move laterally or escalate privileges around the network. Once they figure out what they got access to and what they can do malicious, what's the data inside their network, the final phase comes into account the actions where they're exfiltrating the data, when they're encrypting the data. So, like, For example, that example that I gave with Cope Group, they've actually prevented that final part of exfiltration and encryption the data. But on the other hand, they were affected by some sort of denial of service, again, as said, because they have to disable the systems to prevent the attack.
So, Eddie, are there any measures or any metrics online around when credentials are leaked onto the dark web, how quickly they're used before an organization realizes?
Yeah, this is a very good question, Edwin, because there are providers. Actually, a lot of these credentials are publicly freely available. A lot of databases are simply dropped on the internet. You just got to know where to look. Of course, some databases you have to pay for. There are services, threat intel services that can be provided by organizations like, for example, us, where we can alert our customers that we're seeing leaked credentials to the third-party services that they're using, but we know that people tend to reuse passwords. So, if somebody has some password to whatever HubSpot or whatever third-party services, maybe they're using the same password for the company email. So yeah, there are services that can let you know that somebody on the dark web is trying to sell or simply leaking credentials of your employees or maybe accesses to some of your systems. If you know where to look, you can probably monitor. Uh, there is a bit risk related to that because threat actors can try to drop some fake uh, information about the attack, but still, again, it is worth to monitor that and making sure that you're aware of any leaked credentials, any leaked access to your systems before some bad guys will get that access and try to compromise your environment. Okay, just a bit word about the groups that we're seeing in the ransomware industry. So the top most active group, as I said, you've seen there are over 200 high profile groups. Not all of them are actually active right now. Some of them have some free time, but they will be back in a couple of months. But the most active groups: Club, Akira, Killian, Ransom Hub, Play, Babu. If we want to narrow that down strictly to the retail industry, I would probably mention Lockbit, currently one of the most prolific ransomware group in the world, operating in a ransomware as a service platform. They were seized a couple of times. Their current platform's named version 3.0, so the FBI, the authorities managed to break their services a couple of times. But as you're seeing, unfortunately, they came back to business. This is their advantage of having like distributed business model. Play, probably also they're fairly new player. I think the first attacks from Play Group were seen in 2022, but yeah, they've risen very aggressively, quickly, hitting organizations across Americas and Europe. They were seen on the scene first in late 2021 as a very sophisticated ransomware as a service group. They're mostly targeting VMware systems, and they're been known for coding a very sophisticated malware using high profile languages that are not well recognized by the EDR system, like, for example, Rust coding language. And yeah, Club ransomware, of course, on the top of the group, of the top of the table. They've been targeting retailers industry by exploiting software from supply chains. Like, for example, a very, very large hack in 2023 of MoveIt file transfer platform. It actually affected a lot of retailers.
So, Jeffrey, I understand you obviously research a lot of threat groups. Obviously, Scattered Spider were attributed to a lot of the retail attacks in the UK, but how do they link to these groups?
Yeah, that's a great question, Edwin. So yeah, like Edwin just mentioned, Scarlet Spider isn't one of these groups here because these are all they actually have their own ransomware binary, right? So Akira has their own kind of ransomware binary, Ransom Hub, etc. So Scarlet Spider kind of fits in that RAS, that ransomware as a service kind of model. So they have the ability as kind of their own threat actor group to pick and choose. So they're not impacted by takedowns like Alfie Black Hat SkyRispiter used to be a very big user of that kind of ransomware binary. Obviously, Alfie Black Hat got exit scam taken down. However, they wanted to kind of play it off. But that's not a problem for SkyRispiter because they didn't build that encryptor. They're not going to be impacted by that takedown. They'll hop over to the next place that does ransomware as a service. So right now they use Dragon Force ransomware. That's kind of what you're seeing reported with the Mark and Spencer stuff, Dragon Force, SkyRispiter. So it's very prominent to understand that like while you can take down kind of one of these ransomware operators and then maybe that kind of strain that can't be encrypted, there's a whole underlying model that just allows kind of that shift. Like they can any day they can just hop into the many RAS platforms that are out there. So it's sometimes it can seem like a losing battle, but it just goes to kind of show the sophistication and the kind of industry that's moving behind these kind of things.
And would Scattered Spider pay up front for the ransomware as a service, or would they split the profits that they make with the attacks?
Yeah, that's a great question. So a couple different things will come into play. Scattered Spider, because they're such a big player in the RAS environment, they can negotiate more than kind of your average. If us four wanted to create our own kind of threat actor group, we would have to negotiate probably like 80-20 split. I'm not exactly sure, but Scattered Spider with their prominence, with their sophistication, they could maybe negotiate a 90-10 split or something like that. And then there's also the kind of payout to if SkyRispiter is using an initial access broker, so that they can also come into play. Who actually gave SkyRispiter that kind of access to some company, right? So maybe they get 5% of that. So you can see the profit sharing can vary widely depending on the strain, the ransomware that they're actually using that binary, and then if they're using a IAB, the initial access broker, that kind of stuff.
Let's move to try to identify what are the tactics and techniques used by those threat actors uh, to actually get in and compromise the organization. So, first of all, a reference to the MITRE attack framework. I will always repeat this is a very, very good, constantly evolving framework that probably should be used by everybody who's in the cybersecurity industry. It's a very good source of knowledge for both the offensive security who's planning the attack and for the defensive to understand who how uh, is attacking and most importantly what can they do to defend themselves. There are a couple of phases in a typical attack chain, as I mentioned. So initial access probably one of the first phase, and I think we can tell like three the most abused techniques for getting initial access. Phishing attacks, I think it's probably the biggest part of how the initial access is happening right now. We all know, unfortunately, that human are the weakest link. Exploiting public-facing applications, of course, unpatched applications that are exposed on the external interface. They're providing the access to the internal, and of course, what we said with those initial access brokers, using a stolen credentials, using a valid stolen credentials to get access uh, to the internal network, to the IT environment of the target organization. Once the threat actors are in, they have to figure out some lateral movement and privilege escalation techniques. I think that it is very important to highlight that a lot of those techniques are actually something that you probably won't see as a malicious traffic in your network, in your environment. For example, if you're seeing a valid user doing some remote desktop protocol access, you think it's a normal way of operating. There is a technique actually called living off the land, where the threat actors are actually abusing a legitimate software. So you won't see any stuff. You actually won't see a sophisticated malware. Of course, there is sometimes, but sometimes you won't see a sophisticated malware that is something that pops out maybe in some detection or even looking at a file system. Sometimes threat actors are using the software that you do recognize, like for example, TeamViewer or AnyRun, which are typical remote desktop accessing platforms used by many support providers. And you can imagine in retail services, where somebody is requiring support for a POS system. Of course, they will have probably some remote support systems installed. Uh, I'm also speaking about a lot of tools that are natively deployed on the Windows systems that threat actors can actually abuse to either encrypt the data. For example, there are cryptographic tools in the Windows, so threat actors don't need to implement malware that's making the encryption of the files when doing that ransomware, when encrypting the files to prevent the access to the files. They can actually use one of the binaries provided by Windows system. And probably your SOC team or CSERT team won't identify use of this tool as malicious because this is a legitimate Microsoft provided tool. For doing privilege escalation and lateral movement, threat actors are dumping credentials from the computers, most importantly from the computer's memory. When somebody is logged in on the computer, we can dump credentials of that users. When we get access to the domain controllers, we actually can dump credentials of every user in the Active Directory. And while these are not clear text credentials, this is a form of a ticket of a password hash that can be used to get access. And steal or forge Kerberos tickets this is also one of the techniques commonly seen in a ransomware attacks. Uh, for a persistence, again, as mentioned, valid accounts, threat actors sometimes create accounts. If you're seeing a domain admin account that you're not aware who it is, or even low privileged user, but you're not aware who it is, it's not your employee, then you better check out if this is not something created by a threat actor that's been in your network. There are, of course, other techniques used for persistence, like, for example, boot and log and auto start scripts. So threat actors are creating simple scripts that are executed with every reboot of the computer or where a user logs in. And that scripts creates, for example, a connectivity to a command and control platform of the threat actors. uh, and yeah, of course, that final phase of the attack where they're causing encryption and they're exfiltrating data. I think also an important thing to note here is a technique which we called in the offensive security, we call living off trusted site. And again, this is similar with that living off the land binaries where threat actors are abusing legitimate binaries, legitimate computer software to make something bad. In the same way, the threat actors are abusing legitimate online services to either exfiltrate the data or create a communication between whatever the malware that deployed on your system. Like, for example, if you're seeing some data being uploaded to a Dropbox or OneDrive, you probably don't think it's wrong because your organization is using OneDrive, right? Or somebody is accessing AWS S3 services, or you're seeing a traffic to a Twitter accounts. That's a totally legitimate traffic when you look just from a high perspective on it. But when you dig into details, you will see that either somebody is doing some encrypted communication there, maybe some instructions for the malware binaries are hidden. Or maybe there's a large amount of data going out of your network, which shouldn't happen. And yeah, probably the thing that most of you are interested in most. So how to defend yourself, what to do. So I'm not going to give you like specific details and instructions what to do because there's too much. We would have to spend months or even longer to implement all the security recommendations. But from a high level perspective, what I can tell you as an offensive expert, where I see weaknesses in the organizations that we're doing penetration testing for. So first of all, be prepared for attack. Have a playbook that tells you what to do when you get compromised. And just to give you an example, we had like phishing engagement where we send a phishing email to the employees and we're receiving, let's say we're sending a phishing email to 100 employees and a fifth one is responding to us, ha ha ha, I know that this is a simulation or you're a threat actor. I won't follow that link or click on that link or give you credentials. And 5 minutes later, his colleague from the desk next to him actually clicks that link. So that's a problem because employees don't know what to do, how to respond when something bad happening. And you better don't wait until that happens. You better be prepared, do some tabletop exercise, and try to figure out what will happen and how you can react when a bad thing happen in your network. Implement a robust vulnerability management, a security management program. So there's a lot of things you can do. Proactive security. So from audits, vulnerability scan, penetration tests, and finally some attack simulations, red purple teaming engagements. Uh, have people responsible for managing. This is, security is a process. It's not a project. So you have to implement it continuously. Be proactive, but also be reactive. You know that there is nothing like 100% security. So not any engagement will help you to implement controls that will secure you in 100%. You have to assume that you might be breached at some point. So it's very important that you do a reactive security. So you're monitoring your network. You have a SOC team, you have a SIEM implemented, you have a good coverage that covers all of your attack surface, and you can respond to that. Educate your employees. As I said, employees the weakest link. Continuous security awareness programs. Get them to understand the newest techniques. Like, for example, two-factor authentication is a fancy thing, but there are ways to bypass it. There are techniques to bypass it, so you can't just say, "Yeah, we're having two-factor authentication, so we're secure." People have to understand what's actually secure in terms of having two-factor authentication. And most importantly, one of the biggest problem I think from my perspective as an offensive security expert is you don't understand your attack surface. So you gotta understand it. You gotta see the broader view of what are your assets. These are not just the computers in your network. All those IoT devices, cameras, printers. I've seen companies implementing a highly advanced EDR system and only scanning Windows software, but don't looking at the routers, firewalls, or other appliances, CCTV implemented. People are bringing devices to the offices, smartwatches, cell phones. These are also assets that cause a risk in your environment because they are connected when they are connected to your network. Not to mention everything that's outside your organization, publicly available, your domains, your email accounts of your employees on the third-party platforms, what we spoke, what Edwin asked about. These are all your assets that create some risk for you. And you have to understand all of those assets and understand what's the risk related to these assets.
And Jeffrey, in your opinion, what controls or practices have you seen that make the biggest difference in reducing risk?
Yeah, that's a great question, Edwin. Again, like to what Edward said, like there are so many things, and it can really feel overwhelming for companies who are just really trying to get started, and they only have limited resources, limited time for this stuff. But just simple things like one, like understanding like your attack surface, understanding like the critical either servers, kind of data in your organization, and then seeing what you can do to protect that, right? Like if you have limited resources and you can't do all of this crazy firewall stuff, like maybe just, okay, maybe lockdown restrictions via networking to that one server, just simple things like that. And then of course, like anyone will say MFA, like in this day and age, if you're using anything other than kind of some kind of number matching MFA, phishing resistant MFA via like a UB token, it's just not the level that it needs to be. Like we need to get having MFA, not having MFA obviously is a critical nightmare, but having like email MFA where an employee can set up kind of like their personal Gmail account to receive that kind of stuff, because the moment that Gmail account gets compromised, that's again, like Edward said, low hanging fruit. Then I can just send the password reset email to the compromised employee's personal Gmail address. So it's just little things like that. So yeah, I think MFA, if there's anything to kind of go after today, is make sure everything in your network is MFA. I know that's not as pretty as saying like zero trust or something like that, but that's the best thing you can do today.
So how difficult is it to bypass MFA?
Edward is laughing for good reason. Because I think we were sold MFA as incredibly secure, but in reality, MFA can be you can kind of hijack the MFA token that's going out. You can kind of proxy, you can set up a fake web page that's proxying all of that kind of traffic. You look like you're going through the exact current Google or Microsoft kind of authentication flow. In reality, you're creating that session for that attacker on the back end, which they can then use. So really, to be honest, the best MFA is phishing resistance. That'd be like your UB keys, that kind of stuff. Understanding that it's a challenge. You know what I mean? You have to get executive buy-in to take that next step, and everyone has to walk around with some kind of like UB key on their device. That kind of stuff. Certificates are also maybe something that could work in the meantime. You can use kind of some conditional access policies to lock down devices that are actually able to access internal network, maybe like a SharePoint or maybe some kind of OneDrive. Even you can do IP restriction on like things like Snowflake and stuff like that. So there's a lot of different things that you can do. But yeah, long story short, MFA definitely can be bypassed in our traditional sense of it right now.
Let me, Edwin, add something on top of that because I really like, telling that this shows like typical hacker's mindset in terms of that MFA. Okay, so you got that security key set up, but why do you leaving a fallback method that allows me to click a fallback method and use the recovery password that's delivered to your Gmail account, as Jeffrey said, right? This is also important, right? So again, as Jeffrey said, so MFA has been presented in the industry as a like a holy grail to prevent identity hijacking, credential hijacking. But unfortunately, people need to understand how it works and how we make it secure. So it actually provides that level of security. Hardware tokens and only the hardware tokens. That's the only security tokens. That's the only efficient cryptographically secure. That's the only probably these days efficient way to make sure the MFA is doing what it's supposed to do, preventing hijacking of your access credentials. That's all we have to say. Don't know if we have any questions
Yep,
from the audience.
there's a few that's come in. Bear with me while I read this one out. So, with regards to the Marks and Spencer's example, the hacking group exposed several internal system failures that contributed to the breach's severity. Should the third-party desk have had robust verification processes for password resets and MFA changes? So, was there an over-reliance on third-party systems, and how do we properly ensure and assess third-party adhere to a secure standard before we embrace the relationship? And prior cyber simulations by Marks and Spencers was chaotic. So how can a company improve drills? So there's a few questions in that one. So should the third-party help desk have had a robust verification process for password resets and MFA changes? Was there an over-reliance on third-party systems? And how do we ensure and assess third parties adhere to a secure standard before we embrace a relationship? And how can a company improve drills? So 4 questions. Let me know if I need to read that out. It's a long one.
Yeah, I can take the first kind of stab on it, and Edward, you can kind of fill in here. So I think that the main thing that kind of caught my eye here was the third party help desk. Um, I'm not exactly sure with Mark and Spencer's, but Skyred Spider has gone after casinos in Las Vegas, for example, where you could just call the help desk. And of course, when you're a retail entity that has thousands of locations, right, or hundreds of locations, like you need some kind of probably third party help desk to kind of help filter all the noise. Hey, I'm locked out of my cash register. I can't log in to time in to work or something like that. So I don't think it's a bad thing to have a third party system at all, of course. I do think that maybe, and I'm sure they're doing this right now, is kind of looking at their controls. When someone calls in and says, "Hey, I need to change my MFA," does that need to be met with or paired with some kind of managerial communication? The help desk gets on the phone with the manager with a trusted phone number, maybe over their Teams or Google Voice or whatever, and says, "Hey, let's hop on a video call. Let's exchange ID." Kind of that kind of verification. Obviously, understanding that that's not even foolproof today, but kind of just making it a little bit and a little bit and a little bit harder for those adversaries can just at least delay time for maybe security to get involved and kind of maybe take a closer look. Did M&S get targeted over a period of weeks of the same kind of numbers calling in? saying that they want to reset their MFA? Are there certain users in the organization that security has to be involved? Like if a global administrator, for example, ever wants to reset their MFA, security needs to be involved in that call, that conversation, maybe multiple calls, multiple kind of checks to make sure that person's the legit person because of the level of access they have. Just those kind of questions are really, at least from the MFA side, what I would kind of ask an organization.
Uh, I will only add to that that, trying to answer that question actually takes us back to that zero trust, right? We didn't want to talk about this a lot because unfortunately this became a buzzword being abused by the security providers and overall in the industry. But if we get it back a couple of steps to the beginning, that zero trust is actually a philosophy, right? Where the goal is not to trust anything and verify, are you actually that provider, are you actually, this is the value data, and this can be achieved by cryptography signatures, by verifying if you're, for example, you're asking shouldn't trust in the retailers, it's just third party providers. Yeah, for example, if you're a retailer, you have a third party provider, you can ask them, are they doing penetration tests, can they present the report from such a penetration test, right? You may not be a technical person, but maybe you have your provider that can also check that results. We've been doing this a couple of times. Have a just a third party of eyes taking a look at that. That's very important. Of course, it falls back down. Everything falls back down to the cost of implementing security. But yeah, that zero trust philosophy is actually about that. You don't trust anything. You actually have to verify, double check everything, and actually question everything and challenge everything. Is it properly implemented? Is it secure? Remember what I said, that security is a process.
Definitely. And this last question here regarding the M&S actual like simulation drills. I think you don't really even have to use like an AI tool to come up with crazy scenarios. Like you can just look at the news and there's all types of different scenarios that your team can then take to some kind of call, some kind of meeting conference room, and then just kind of war game them, simulate what would we do in the situation. Like a tabletop doesn't have to be like we put fake malware on the system and then let it spread. Like you can at least talk about these things. There's nothing wrong with doing an actual technical tabletop, but just talking about these things. Who would we call? When would legal be involved? When we need to escalate to kind of our CEO? Just those kind of questions. Just having them prior will save you so much time in the actual incident because you'll actually be familiar with, oh, this is the kind of connection to this system, or oh, if this computer is compromised, this is what they could then access. Or does our SaaS tenant have MFA on it? Just you start kind of unwinding these kind of crazy scenarios that, like anything else, become a lot less scary when you actually just start talking about it.
So, Jeffrey, from your opinion, in terms of building resilience for organizations, and a lot of people on this call, from different organizations, they're probably getting questions from their leadership around what should they do, where should they spend the budget.
Yeah.
What have you seen in terms of what normally prompts leadership teams to take cybersecurity seriously and address these concerns?
Yeah, so unfortunately, it usually can happen two ways. One is kind of the reactive approach. Something bad happens, and then you kind of maybe get an increase in budget or some kind of people take it more seriously at organization. I think obviously all organizations want to do a more proactive approach, right? Where you're kind of explaining the risk to senior leaders in a language that maybe makes sense. Maybe explain financial downtime that could occur. Maybe explain risk to kind of company reputation if something occurs. So you want to speak the language that is going to make sense. You don't approach it from a technical standpoint always. Well, I'm sure you can with the applicable party. So yeah, I think there's a lot of different ways to do it, a lot of different projects. Again, I think identity is huge right now. Like if I could encourage any organization to kind of focus on one thing, we're seeing adversaries go after identity time and time again. Not to kind of name drop, but Push Security came out with a great report on identity that I encourage people to check out. But yeah, I think there's identity is really the main thing there, and kind of when you start to visualize for others in the organization the interconnectivity of all our different processes, and if okay, if this thing gets compromised, then this happens, and just start when you start displaying it to an audience, it kind of shares not fear, but it shares the concern, and it can motivate teams to motivate the organization to then take those next steps for better outcomes.
Absolutely. Okay. And then another question that was sent in directly. What are the signs that an attacker is already in the network but hasn't launched ransomware yet?
Oh, that's tough. That's a really tough question, and I'll pass it to Edward after this for his kind of analysis. But that's kind of where having that kind of robust monitoring helps. Having some kind of SIM, having an EDR tool that can kind of, because all you need is an adversary to mess up one time. All you need is for them to drop one kind of file on that matches some kind of signature or matches some kind of heuristic detection that EDR can pick up on. So it's sometimes as defenders we can get kind of a little bit depressed about like it's always a never-ending cycle. But I like to think of the optimist in me that like all we need is for them to mess up one time and then we can catch them. So in your tabletops, you can start thinking about like, hey, we talked about this whole scenario. Like, what are some things? What are some detections we can build in our sim? What are some what are some kind of playbooks that we can build for our IT help desk or whatever that can maybe catch some of this stuff before? Because one time, I just want to stress that we just need to catch them one time before something really bad happens, and then we can kind of unravel their entire web.
Uh, I can also add on top of that, Edwin. So, also from my own experience, what the organization should look like is a behavioral analysis. Any anomaly that you can. Of course, it requires a robust detection system, right? Your typical log monitoring probably can't do that, but if you build some rules, it is possible to do that to identify typical behaviors. And what you should search is anomaly. Like, for example, let's say you're seeing John Doe, IT admin, accessing multiple computers, which is fine. He's an IT administrator, he can help people. But if you're seeing him accessing like 20, 30 computers a day, that's probably something suspicious. This is what should be looked for. So behavioral analysis, this is very important. This is a problematic because, yeah, to get a proper signals, you have to understand your typical behaviors, right? And if you overestimate that, you will be flooded with a lot of signals that are false positive. This is also something we don't want to have because across a lot of false positives, which can be simply checked by the SOC security analyst. Okay, it's fine. There may be one hidden that's actual attack. But yeah, behavior analysis, understanding typical behavior. Whenever you're implementing some new technology, some new level of complexity comes in, you got to do a proper investigation of its security, how it works, and what risk it introduced to your system. So proactive security.
Brilliant. In a minute, I'll ask you both your top tips that you would give for organizations. But before that, I just want to ask my own question. So I believe it was Mike Tyson said that everyone has a plan until they get punched in the face. So how useful are instant response plans and testing those plans when you actually face a ransomware scenario?
Having I was just gonna say, having the plan will save you so much because what people don't talk about is during an incident, like it can take days, it can take weeks. You know what I mean? People are tired, people are hungry. You know what I mean? Like people, like the attitudes start to kind of unravel. People might get irritated and stuff like that. And then having that kind of playbook to always go back to, always reference, even if it's not going to cover everything, right? It would be a million pages. It would never end. But at least having something that you can kind of look to in terms when people are tired, when people are looking for direction, like that can be really crucial. It can help save a lot of time when you're trying to find an organization. Who do we talk to about this product? Who do we talk to about this application? Or the server, whatever, you'll save yourself a lot of headache.
This is very crucial, Edwin. Remember, the timing is very important here. As you remember, as I said, the actual last phase of a typical attack happening is at the end, and long time before there's already something going on. So if you got a proper response plan when you're seeing some malicious malware executed in your environment, maybe you do know how to prevent it, how to isolate. That's what, for example, the cooperative group done, right? They've had a plan. They've disabled all the VPN, shut down all the VPN access, And luckily, they didn't face that last phase of the exfiltration and the encryption of the data, which could cause a denial of service. And I know because a lot of companies, and you also know, because a lot of people are calling to us and asking, guys, I'm probably in the middle of attack. I see a ransom note on my computer. I can access files, and I completely don't know what to do. They're now just trying to call every company on the internet and asking what should they do, and they're losing hours.
So final audience question from Connor Kinsella. Do you think tabletop exercises simulating a breach are a good team exercise to run? And if so, how often should they be run?
I think internally as like your team, I would say like monthly. Like you don't need, obviously it doesn't hurt to bring in like a third party to have these. Maybe you can use some more technical things or have different discussions, but internally as like your information security team, I would say monthly. It can be a 30-minute call, just kind of planning that. And then a couple of times a year, maybe quarterly, I would involve different parties, involve legal to that tabletop, and then focus kind of the scenario around maybe something that would involve legal or maybe your privacy department, maybe your tech ops team or your cloud development team, something like that, just to kind of get different perspectives and then test out different scenarios. So you're not just, okay, every scenario, every tabletop we do is always focused around ransomware. While that's good for maybe one or two, like maybe there's some kind of other attack, maybe some kind of data breach that isn't ransomware or some kind of malware. Yeah, so I think it's good you want to test out a bunch of different scenarios.
Okay, brilliant. 1 minute left. So I might just ask for sorry, Eddie, your top tip or one piece of advice that you both give to organizations to prevent ransomware and stopping data exfiltration.
Okay, so I'll go first. My tip is, lower the complexity of your infrastructure, implement least privilege model. You don't need all those technologies that you have, and that technology actually creates a bigger risk in your environment.
Yeah, and I'll go off Edwards there, like know who has those higher level permissions, right? Make sure that not everybody has those high level permissions, but those that do, monitor them, detect when someone's added to some kind of privileged group, when someone does something that's kind of deviates from the norm. I think that's a great next step to take.
Fantastic. Well, thank you both so much. That's bang on 1 hour mark. So really appreciate your time and insights. And I hope everyone listening also found it very interesting and can take away some actions for your own organizations. Thank you very much.